Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. I never imagined my life would become a cautionary tale whispered between women who lower their voices when they talk about family. I used to believe that loyalty, once proven, was permanent, that blood meant safety, that marriage, when nurtured with patience and sacrifice, was unbreakable. Those were the truths I lived by for nearly 20 years, and they shaped every decision I made, especially the one that changed everything. The day my younger sister called me crying, saying her marriage was over, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask questions. I didn't protect myself. I opened my heart and my wallet, and I told her, "I've got you." I didn't know that sentence would cost me my husband. My name is Marissa. I was 46 when all of this happened, married for 22 years to a man named Daniel, a man I thought I knew as well as I knew my own breath. We had built a quiet, respectable life together. Not flashy, not perfect, but steady. A home with creaky stairs, a backyard where we drank coffee on Sunday mornings, and routines that wrapped around us like muscle memory. I worked as an administrative manager at a medical practice. Daniel ran a small contracting business. We didn't have children, not because we didn't want them, but because life had decided otherwise. Over time, that absence became something we carried together, a shared tenderness, a silent agreement that we were still a family of two. My sister Alana was different from me in every way, 7 years younger, louder, softer at the same time. She moved through life emotionally while I moved through it carefully. She married young to a man named Victor, and for years I watched her struggle in ways I didn't know how to fix. Their marriage was messy, full of arguments that spilled into family gatherings and apologies that never lasted. I offered advice when asked, money when I could, and distance when I sensed my presence only added fuel. But when she called me that night, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words, something in me broke open. She said Victor had been unfaithful. She said she had nothing, no savings, no plan. She said she was scared. And when your little sister tells you she's scared, it doesn't matter how old you are. You become the older sister again instantly, the protector, the one who steps in. I told Daniel about the call while I was still sitting on the edge of the bed, phone warm in my hand. He listened quietly, rubbing his eyes, then nodded and said, "Of course we'll help her. She's family." Those words would echo later, twisted into something unrecognizable. The divorce moved fast and slow at the same time, fast in paperwork, slow in emotional fallout. Alana moved into our guest room while the legal process unfolded, just for a little while, she said. A few weeks, maybe a couple of months. I paid for the lawyer. I covered the filing fees. I wrote checks with a strange mix of pride and fear, telling myself this was what strong families did. I told myself I was doing the right thing. Daniel agreed, at least outwardly. He was kind to her, patient. He carried her suitcases, fixed the loose handle on her dresser, made jokes to lighten the air when she cried at the kitchen table. At first, it felt like we were all healing together. Alana cooked dinner some nights. She laughed more. She started wearing makeup again, dressing better, standing a little taller. I was glad to see it. I wanted her to feel whole again. What I didn't notice, or maybe didn't want to notice, was how comfortable she became in our space, how easily she slipped into our rhythms. She knew when Daniel left for work, when he came home. He knew his favorite snacks, his coffee order, the way he liked his shirts folded. I told myself it was normal. We were all under one roof. We were family. Looking back now, I can see the small moments that should have stopped me cold. The way conversations paused when I entered the room. The way Alana laughed a little too hard at Daniel's jokes. The way he started lingering in the kitchen when she was there, leaning against the counter like he had nowhere else to be. But at the time, my mind refused to assemble those pieces into a picture I couldn't survive. I trusted them both. That trust felt like a badge of honor. I wore it proudly, never realizing it was blinding me. I remember one evening clearly, though I didn't understand its weight until much later. I had worked late and came home exhausted, my feet aching, my patience thin. When I opened the front door, I heard music playing softly, Alana's favorite old R&B playlist. I smelled garlic and onions. They were cooking together, Daniel and Alana, laughing over something trivial. For a moment, it looked like a snapshot from a life that wasn't mine. They turned when they heard me, smiling, and Daniel said, "We're making your favorite." I smiled back, grateful, touched. I didn't see the way Alana's eyes lingered on him. I didn't see the intimacy that had already begun to grow in the space I thought was safe. As weeks turned into months, the divorce finalized. I paid the final bill without complaint. Alana cried in my arms, thanking me, telling me she could never repay me, calling me her savior. Those words wrapped around my heart and tightened. I believed them. I needed to believe them. Daniel hugged her too, longer than necessary, but I told myself that was just compassion, just family. I had no idea that the foundation of my marriage was already cracking quietly beneath my feet. There's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It moves gently, politely, wearing the face of gratitude and shared meals. That was the kind growing in my home, and while I was busy being the dependable sister, the generous wife, the woman who held everyone together, something precious was being taken from me without my consent. I just didn't know it yet. Not then. Not until the truth found me in a way I couldn't ignore. The first time I felt truly unsettled, I dismissed it as fatigue. That's what women like me do. We explain away discomfort so we can keep functioning. I told myself I was tired from work, from being emotionally present for everyone else, from carrying responsibilities that didn't leave room for suspicion. Still, something had shifted in my house. The air felt heavier. Conversations felt staged, like lines delivered after rehearsal. Daniel started showering later at night. Alana started taking longer walks in the evenings, always saying she needed fresh air. I never questioned where those walks led. I trusted my home. I trusted my marriage. I trusted my sister. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her divorce was finalized, I came home early, unexpectedly. The clinic had a power outage and we were sent home without notice. I remember sitting in my car for a moment before going inside, enjoying the rare quiet of an unplanned afternoon. When I opened the front door, the house was silent. No music, no television. I called out Daniel's name, then Alana's. No answer. I assumed Daniel was still at work and Alana was out. I dropped my bag on the chair and walked toward the kitchen, already thinking about making tea. That's when I heard a laugh. Soft, familiar. Alana's laugh. It was coming from the back of the house, from our bedroom, my bedroom. I froze where I stood, my heart suddenly pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I told myself there was a simple explanation. She was probably looking for something. Maybe she was on the phone. I walked slowly down the hallway, each step heavier than the last, my mind racing to construct a version of reality that wouldn't break me. When I pushed the door open, Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, tying his shoes. Alana stood near the dresser holding a sweater. They both looked up at me at the same time, surprise flashing across their faces before they could mask it. The moment stretched. Too long. Long enough for me to notice the way her cheeks were flushed. Long enough to see the way his hand lingered on his knee, tense, guilty. "Oh," Alana said quickly. "I was just borrowing a sweater. I spilled coffee on mine." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I came home early too. Thought I'd help her find one." Their words slid into place neatly like puzzle pieces designed to fit. And I let them. I laughed it off, joked about her raiding my closet, and turned away before either of them could see the unease settling deep in my chest. That night, I lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering when my instincts had started whispering and why I had trained myself not to listen. After that, the small things multiplied. Daniel guarded his phone more closely. Alana stopped talking about her plans for the future. When I asked if she was looking for her own place, she would smile vaguely and say she was figuring things out. I offered to help with the deposit, furniture, anything she needed. She hugged me tightly and said she wasn't ready yet. I told myself healing takes time. I told myself love requires patience. One evening, I suggested that Daniel and I take a weekend trip, just the two of us. We hadn't been away together in years. I framed it as a way to reconnect, to breathe. Daniel hesitated, then said he didn't think it was a good time. "Alana's still fragile," he said. "I don't want her to feel abandoned." That word landed wrong, abandoned, as if my marriage revolved around her needs. I felt a flicker of resentment, quickly smothered by guilt. I didn't want to be the woman who resented her sister's pain. The truth has a way of surfacing when you stop fighting it. Mine came to me through something so ordinary it almost feels cruel. Laundry. I was folding clothes one Saturday morning when I picked up a blouse that wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately. Alana's. It smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne. I stood there holding it, my hands trembling, my mind replaying every dismissed moment, every uneasy feeling I had buried. That was when the picture finally assembled itself, clear and devastating. I didn't confront them right away. I needed certainty. I needed proof strong enough to hold me upright when everything collapsed. Over the next week, I watched more closely. I noticed how Alana avoided my eyes when Daniel entered a room. I noticed how he softened around her in a way he no longer did with me. I noticed how they found reasons to be alone together when they thought I was distracted. Each observation felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. The confirmation came late one night. I had woken thirsty and padded quietly toward the kitchen. As I passed the guest room, I noticed the door was ajar and the room was empty. My stomach dropped. I followed the faint sound of murmured voices to the living room. The lights were low. They were sitting close together on the couch, too close. Daniel's hand rested on her knee. Alana's head was tilted toward him in a way that was unmistakably intimate. They didn't see me at first. They were lost in whatever fragile justification they had built together. When they finally noticed me standing there, the silence was deafening. No excuses this time, no explanations rushed forward. Their faces told me everything. I remember feeling strangely calm, as if my body had decided to go numb to survive the moment. I asked one question, just one. "How long?" Alana burst into tears. Daniel looked at the floor. Neither of them answered immediately, and that hesitation was its own confession. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was quiet, ashamed. He said, "It wasn't planned. It just happened." Those words felt like an insult, as if betrayal was an accident, like spilling coffee on a sweater. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I told Alana to pack her things and leave my house that night. I told Daniel we would talk in the morning. The strength in my voice surprised even me. That night, I slept alone in my bed, staring at the same ceiling that had witnessed my doubts weeks earlier, knowing my life had split into a before and an after. By morning, the house felt hollow. Alana was gone. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched. He apologized. He said he was confused. He said he never meant to hurt me. I listened, detached, absorbing the weight of his words without letting them crush me. I asked him to leave too. I told him I needed space. For the first time in decades, I chose myself. What followed were weeks of reckoning, lawyers, quiet dinners alone, long walks where I replayed every decision that led me here. I grieved my marriage, my sisterhood, the woman I used to believe love alone could protect her. I realized that generosity without boundaries can become an invitation to betrayal, that rescuing someone doesn't give them the right to dismantle your life. Alana tried to call. She sent messages filled with apologies and explanations, saying she hadn't meant it for it to go so far, that she was lonely, that Daniel had comforted her. I didn't respond. Some wounds require distance to heal. Some betrayals don't deserve dialogue. In the quiet aftermath, I found clarity. I saw how often I had put myself last, how I had mistaken sacrifice for virtue. I learned that family is not defined by blood alone, but by respect, honesty, and restraint. Losing them hurt more than I can describe, but losing myself would have hurt more. I don't know what the future holds. I only know that I survived a betrayal I never thought possible, and I emerged with my dignity intact. And that, I've learned, is something no one can steal unless you hand it over willingly. The weeks after Daniel moved out passed in a blur that felt both heavy and strangely quiet. The house no longer held tension, but it also no longer held warmth. Every room echoed. I learned quickly how loud silence can be when you're no longer sharing it with someone who once knew your every habit. I moved through my days on autopilot, going to work, coming home, cooking meals I barely touched. At night, I slept on my side of the bed, even though there was no longer a reason to. Old muscle memory clung to me like grief. People think betrayal arrives with fireworks, screaming, crying, public scenes. But the real damage happens in the quiet hours, when you start questioning your own judgment. I replayed years of memories, searching for signs I'd missed, conversations that now felt rehearsed, moments of distance I'd once attributed to stress. I wondered how long my marriage had been vulnerable and whether I had unknowingly prepared the ground for what grew there. Those thoughts were dangerous, and I had to actively pull myself back from blaming the wrong person. Compassion is not a crime. Trust is not stupidity. What they did was a choice. Daniel tried to come back, at least emotionally. He sent long emails filled with regret and reflection. He said he felt lost. He said he realized too late what he'd thrown away. He promised counseling, change, transparency. I read every word carefully, not with hope, but with clarity. Something fundamental had broken. Trust, once shattered, doesn't return in the same shape. I told him I needed time, and that time, I discovered, was a teacher that did not negotiate. Alana's absence felt different, heavier. She was my sister, the person who had shared my childhood bedroom, my secrets, my clothes, the person I had defended even when others warned me not to. I remembered nights when she cried to me about feeling invisible in her marriage, about being afraid of ending up alone. I had held her hand and promised she wouldn't. That promise haunted me now. I hadn't imagined that the loneliness she feared would drive her to erase my life instead of building her own. One afternoon, about 2 months after everything fell apart, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. She looked tired, older than I remembered. She hugged me too tightly, then pulled back, studying my face like she was bracing for bad news. Word had spread, of course. It always does. Family fractures are never private for long. She didn't ask questions. She didn't defend Alana. She simply said, "I'm sorry." And in that moment, I felt a weight lift. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to acknowledge the harm without minimizing it. That night, I cried for the first time since the confrontation. Not the sharp panic tears of shock, but slow, deep sobs that came from somewhere ancient. I cried for my marriage. I cried for my sister. I cried for the version of myself who believed that love, once given, would always be returned in kind. When the tears finally stopped, I felt lighter. Grief, I learned, is not something you get over. It's something you move through, step by step, until it becomes part of the landscape instead of the storm. I started therapy soon after, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand why I had ignored my intuition for so long, why I had equated self-sacrifice with moral superiority, why I had allowed my boundaries to blur in the name of kindness. My therapist listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me. She said, "You didn't lose your voice. You just weren't taught to use it when it mattered most." That truth settled into me slowly, reshaping how I saw my past. As the months passed, practical matters demanded attention. Divorce proceedings began, assets were divided. Daniel was cooperative, almost overly so, as if generosity could erase the past. I accepted what was fair and nothing more. I didn't want guilt payments. I wanted closure. When the papers were finally signed, I felt an unexpected calm. It wasn't relief exactly, it was acceptance. The story I thought I was living had ended, and resisting that fact only prolonged the pain. Alana reached out again near the holidays, a handwritten letter this time, delivered through my mother. She wrote about shame and regret. She said she understood if I never forgave her. She said she hoped someday we could speak again. I read the letter once, then placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness is not a performance. It doesn't happen on someone else's timeline. I wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure I ever would be, and that had to be okay. What surprised me most was how my sense of self slowly returned. I started doing small things just for me, taking evening walks without my phone, rearranging furniture, cooking meals I loved instead of meals designed to please someone else. I began to notice my own resilience, how I had faced something unimaginable and continued to show up for my life. Strength, I learned, is often quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It simply keeps going. One evening, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the trees, the same porch where Daniel and I had once planned futures that would never happen. And yet, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt something closer to peace. The betrayal had stripped away illusions, but it also revealed truths about who I was, about what I deserved, about the importance of choosing yourself when others refuse to choose you. I don't know what relationship, if any, I'll have with my sister in the future. I don't know if Daniel will remain a chapter or fade into a footnote. What I do know is this. Paying for my sister's divorce did not make me naive, it made me generous. Her betrayal does not define my worth, it defines her choices. And while I lost a marriage and a sister, I gained something just as valuable, my clarity, my boundaries, my voice. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. Love should never require you to disappear. Support should never come at the cost of your dignity. And betrayal, no matter how close it comes from, does not get to decide the rest of your life. I am still here, still standing, and for the first time in a long time, I am fully my own. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments. Sometimes so small you don't notice them until you look back and realize you're standing straighter than you used to. After the divorce papers were finalized, I expected to feel empty. Instead, I felt alert, as if a fog had lifted and my senses were finally my own again. I began to notice how often I had compromised without realizing it, how many times I had softened my needs so others could remain comfortable. That awareness was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. Friends started inviting me out again, cautiously at first, as if they weren't sure what version of me they would get. I said yes more often than I said no, not because I wanted distraction, but because I wanted reconnection. Over dinners and quiet walks, I told parts of my story, not the dramatic details, but the emotional truth. People listened. Some shared their own betrayals, stories they had never voiced out loud. I realized how common this kind of pain is and how rarely we give it space to breathe. My relationship with my mother deepened in ways I hadn't expected. She never pressured me to forgive Alana. She never defended her actions. She simply reminded me that protecting my heart didn't make me cruel. It made me wise. One afternoon, while we sat folding laundry together like we used to when I was younger, she said, "You did what you thought was right. That's all anyone can ever do." Those words settled into me gently, like a blessing I didn't know I needed. Daniel continued to reach out sporadically, updates about his life, apologies that grew less desperate and more reflective. I responded politely, but briefly. Distance clarified everything. Without the constant negotiation of my emotions, I could see him clearly, not as the villain of my story, but as a man who made selfish choices and lacked the courage to face himself honestly. Loving him had once been easy. Respecting myself now mattered more. Work became a place of stability. I took on new responsibilities, projects I'd once avoided because they felt like too much. I found that I was capable of more than I'd allowed myself to believe. Independence does that. It stretches you, shows you the strength that was always there, waiting for permission to emerge. Around that time, I started volunteering at a local women's support group. I hadn't planned to share my story. I went simply to listen. But one evening, after hearing a woman describe how her sister had sided with her abusive partner, something inside me opened. I spoke, quietly, honestly. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone reached for my hand. Another nodded, eyes full of understanding. In that moment, I realized that pain, when shared with intention, can become something else entirely. It can become connection. The holidays came and went. I spent them differently than I ever had. Fewer obligations, more intention. I decorated my home simply, lit candles, cooked meals slowly. I allowed myself to feel moments of sadness without drowning in them. I allowed joy without guilt. Both were welcome. Both belonged. Ilana remained silent. Part of me wondered if she was giving me space out of respect or out of avoidance. I didn't chase an answer. Not knowing became its own kind of peace. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as reconciliation. You can release anger without reopening doors that lead to harm. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about Daniel or Alana in days. The realization startled me, not because I wanted to forget them, but because it signaled something important. They were no longer the center of my emotional world. My life was expanding again, making room for new thoughts, new possibilities. I began planning a trip. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet place near the water where I could sit with my thoughts and watch the horizon stretch endlessly forward. Standing on that shore weeks later, listening to the waves, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for what it forced me to confront, the parts of my life that needed attention, the boundaries that needed reinforcement, the voice that needed to be heard. I don't pretend that everything is perfect now. Some scars remain tender, some memories still sting, but they no longer define me. They inform me. They remind me of my capacity to endure, to adapt, to choose myself again and again. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of your own betrayal, I want you to know something. You are not weak for loving deeply, you are not foolish for trusting, and you are not required to sacrifice your peace to prove your loyalty. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back and let the truth reveal itself. My sister's actions and my husband's choices shattered the life I thought I had, but they also gave me the chance to build a life rooted in honesty, self-respect, and clarity. And that life, I've discovered, is worth protecting at all costs. There is a moment in healing that no one warns you about. It's when the anger fades, but the sadness hasn't completely left yet. When you're no longer consumed by what happened, but you're still standing in the quiet aftermath, asking yourself who you are now that everything familiar has changed. That's where I found myself as the new year began. Not broken, not bitter, just altered. I started noticing how my identity had been shaped by my roles: wife, older sister, reliable one, the woman who held things together so others didn't fall apart. Without those roles anchoring me, I felt unmoored at first. But slowly, something else began to surface: curiosity. I asked myself questions I had never bothered to ask before. What do I want when no one is depending on me? What does peace look like when I don't have to earn it? I made small but deliberate changes. I stopped explaining myself so much. I declined invitations that felt obligatory. I spent money on experiences instead of emergencies. For the first time in years, my savings account wasn't earmarked for someone else's crisis. That realization alone made me sit very still one night, staring at my bank statement with a strange mix of relief and grief. I had given so much of myself away without ever questioning why it felt like my responsibility to do so. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents, I came across the receipt from Alana's divorce attorney. The exact amount stared back at me, crisp and undeniable. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where she had cried and thanked me, where Daniel had squeezed my hand and told me we were doing the right thing. I expected to feel anger. Instead, I felt clarity. That money hadn't just paid for a legal separation, it had paid for a revelation. Expensive, yes. Painful, absolutely. But illuminating. Around that time, Daniel asked to meet in person. I hesitated before agreeing, not because I feared him, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reopening a wound that had finally begun to close. We met at a quiet cafe, neutral ground. He looked older, tired. When he apologized again, it sounded different this time, less about easing his guilt, more about owning his choices. He admitted he had enjoyed feeling needed, that Alana's vulnerability had fed something in him he hadn't examined. Hearing that didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It confirmed what I already knew. When he asked if I thought there was any chance for us, I answered honestly. I told him no, not with anger, not with tears, just certainty. I told him love without trust is survival, not partnership. He nodded, as if he had known the answer before he asked. We parted kindly. That kindness wasn't for him, it was for me. Closure doesn't have to be cruel to be final. The conversation stirred something unexpected in me. Confidence. Not the loud kind, but the quiet assurance that I could handle whatever came next. I began to imagine a future not defined by loss, but by intention. I didn't rush into dating. I wasn't trying to replace what I had lost. I was learning how to inhabit my own life fully, without apology. Then, months later, Alana showed up at my door. I hadn't heard her knock at first. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, thinner, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart raced, my hands went cold. She looked like someone who had been living with the weight of her choices. She asked if she could come in. I told her no, not unkindly, just honestly. We stood on the porch, the space between us heavy with everything unsaid. She cried. She said she had lost Daniel too, that what they thought was comfort had turned into resentment, that she understood now what she had taken from me. She asked for forgiveness not as a demand, but as a hope. I listened. I really listened. When she finished, I told her something I had practiced in therapy but never imagined saying out loud. I told her I forgave her, but I couldn't trust her. And forgiveness without trust meant distance. I told her I wished her healing, but my healing required boundaries she no longer had access to. She nodded through her tears. She didn't argue. That told me she finally understood. When she left, I went back inside and sat down, breathing deeply. Forgiving her didn't erase what happened. It simply freed me from carrying it any longer. That night, I slept peacefully. In the weeks that followed, I felt lighter, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer dictated my present. I had faced both of them. I had spoken my truth without shrinking or exploding. That alone felt like a victory I had earned. I don't know if Alana and I will ever be close again. Some fractures don't mend into their original shape, but I also know that my worth was never tied to being the savior, the fixer, the one who pays the price so others don't have to. I can love deeply and still protect myself. I can be generous without being available for betrayal. And that lesson, hard-earned as it was, has changed the way I walk through the world. After Alana left that day, something inside me settled permanently. Not relief exactly, and not closure in the way people imagine it, but alignment. My words had finally matched my truth. I hadn't softened it to keep the peace, and I hadn't sharpened it to wound her. I stood in myself fully, and that feeling stayed with me in the weeks that followed. Life began to take on a different rhythm. Mornings were quieter, but they belonged entirely to me. I woke up without bracing for anyone else's mood, without planning my day around someone else's needs. I started journaling, something I hadn't done since my 20s, page after page filled with thoughts I had swallowed for years. Reading them back, I saw a pattern I hadn't noticed before. I had always equated love with endurance. I believed staying, paying, fixing, and forgiving were measures of devotion. Letting go felt like failure, until it didn't. I also noticed how my body responded to freedom. My shoulders relaxed, my jaw unclenched. I laughed more easily, without checking myself. Trauma doesn't just live in memory, it lives in muscle, breath, posture. As my life became simpler, my body began to trust again. People sometimes ask if I regret paying for my sister's divorce. It's a complicated question. If I could rewind time knowing what I know now, would I make the same choice? No. But regret implies foolishness, and I don't believe that. I acted from compassion, not weakness. The mistake wasn't helping her. The mistake was helping her without protecting myself. That distinction matters. One evening, while volunteering at the women's group, a young woman asked me how I knew it was time to stop giving. The room grew quiet. Everyone leaned in, waiting for an answer they could apply to their own lives. I told her the truth. When your giving starts costing you your peace, it's no longer love, it's self-erasure. Saying it out loud felt like sealing a promise to myself. Spring arrived softly that year. The trees outside my house bloomed without asking permission, and something about that felt symbolic. I began spending more time outdoors, gardening, walking, sitting in the sun with a book and no agenda. I realized how long it had been since I allowed myself to simply exist without justification. And then, unexpectedly, I met someone. It wasn't dramatic, no fireworks, no sweeping declarations, just a conversation in a bookstore of all places. His name was Thomas. He commented on the book I was holding, and we ended up talking for nearly an hour. He listened more than he spoke. When he asked questions, they were thoughtful, not probing. When I mentioned my divorce, he didn't flinch or try to fix it. He simply nodded and said, "That must have been hard." That response alone told me everything I needed to know about his emotional maturity. I didn't rush anything. We exchanged numbers, met for coffee weeks later, then dinner. I paid close attention to how I felt around him. Safe, unrushed, respected. I noticed how he honored boundaries without needing them explained, how he spoke about the people in his life with accountability, not blame. I wasn't looking for a replacement for Daniel. I was looking for alignment. And for the first time, I trusted myself enough to recognize it. Still, I moved slowly. Healing doesn't mean throwing the doors wide open again without discernment. It means opening them intentionally. Thomas understood that. He never pushed. He never demanded reassurance. His patience felt like kindness, not indifference. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family continued to evolve. My mother remained supportive, though she grieved the distance between her daughters. I assured her that my boundaries weren't punishments, they were protections. She accepted that, even when it hurt. That acceptance strengthened our bond. As for Alana, I heard about her through others. She had moved to a smaller apartment, changed jobs, started therapy. I hoped it was true. I hoped she was doing the work she needed to do. But her journey was no longer mine to monitor. Detachment, I learned, is not cruelty, it's clarity. One afternoon, months later, I stood in front of the mirror and caught my reflection. I looked different. Not younger, not dramatically altered, just present. My eyes were clearer, my posture straighter. I smiled without forcing it. That woman staring back at me had survived something that could have hardened her. Instead, she had softened in the right places and strengthened in the necessary ones. If you had asked me a year earlier who I was, I would have listed my roles: wife, sister, provider. Now my answer was simpler. I am someone who chooses herself, someone who understands that love without boundaries is not noble, it's dangerous. Betrayal taught me that lesson brutally but thoroughly. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone, I no longer see my story as one of loss alone. It's a story of reclamation, of waking up, of remembering that generosity should flow outward, not drain you dry. The woman I am now would still help someone in need, but she would do it with open eyes and a locked door behind her. And that difference has made all the difference. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive the worst thing you once feared. It doesn't make you fearless, it makes you discerning. That was the shift I felt settling into my bones as summer stretched on. I no longer jumped when my phone buzzed. I no longer felt responsible for managing other people's emotions. I had learned, finally, that peace is not passive. It is chosen, protected, and sometimes defended. Thomas and I continued seeing each other, slowly, intentionally. We talked about expectations early on, not in a heavy way, but in an honest one. I told him I wasn't interested in rushing toward a future just to fill a silence. He told me he wasn't interested in rescuing or being rescued. That mutual understanding felt rare, refreshing. We spent time doing ordinary things: grocery shopping, walking through neighborhoods, cooking meals side by side. I paid attention to how ordinary moments felt, because that's where real relationships live. And in those moments, I felt calm. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the sky dim into blue, he asked me what had hurt the most about everything that happened. I thought about it carefully before answering. It wasn't the affair itself, though that pain was sharp. It wasn't even the loss of my marriage. It was the realization that the people I had poured into the most felt entitled to my sacrifice, that they mistook my kindness for permission. Saying that out loud felt like reclaiming something that had been taken quietly over many years. Around that time, my mother called to tell me Alana wanted to attend a family gathering, a birthday, small, just immediate family. My mother asked how I felt about it, and I appreciated that she asked instead of assuming. I sat with the question longer than I expected. I wasn't afraid of seeing my sister. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was aware of the cost. I told my mother I wouldn't attend if Alana was there, not as an ultimatum, just a boundary. My mother sighed softly and said she understood. That understanding mattered. That decision came with consequences. Some family members quietly disagreed. A few thought I was holding a grudge. I let them think that. Not everyone needs access to your truth to respect your choices. I had spent too long explaining myself in hopes of being understood. This time, I chose peace over consensus. Later that week, I received a message from Alana. Short, respectful. She said she understood my boundary and didn't want to cause more pain. She said she was trying to live differently now. I replied with a simple thank you. No reopening, no revisiting, just acknowledgement. That exchange, brief as it was, felt like closure in its own quiet way. Work brought unexpected opportunities. A leadership role opened up, one I never would have considered before. In the past, I might have deferred, worried about the added responsibility. This time, I applied. When I got the position, I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. It was mine, earned, chosen. With that new role came a sense of authority I hadn't realized I lacked. I spoke more confidently, I trusted my judgment, and when conflicts arose, I addressed them directly instead of smoothing them over. I noticed how people responded to clarity. Respect followed, not because I demanded it, because I no longer negotiated my worth. There was one moment, small but significant, that stayed with me. A coworker asked for help on a project that wasn't my responsibility. Old habits stirred, the urge to say yes immediately, to take on more than I should. I paused, asked questions, set limits, offered guidance instead of ownership, and the world didn't collapse. In fact, it worked better. That moment felt like a victory no one else noticed but me. Thomas met my friends gradually. I watched how he treated them, how he listened, how he didn't perform. Trust, I learned, is built by observing patterns over time, not by believing promises. I let time do its work, and time, for once, was kind. Some nights memories still surfaced, the sound of Alana's laugh, the way Daniel used to reach for my hand absent-mindedly. Those memories no longer knocked the wind out of me. They arrived, lingered, and passed. I let them. Healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about changing your relationship to it. I started speaking more openly at the women's group, not as a guide or expert, but as someone willing to tell the truth without polishing it. I talked about how betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes wrapped in familiarity, in shared history, in people who know exactly where to aim. The room often fell quiet when I spoke, not out of shock, but recognition. One woman pulled me aside after a session and said, "I thought loving harder would fix it." I looked at her and said gently, "Loving harder only works when the other person is loving responsibly." She cried. I held her hand. In that moment, I understood why this story mattered beyond me. Pain, when named, loses some of its power. As the year moved forward, I realized something else. I no longer felt the need to prove that I was okay. I didn't need my life to look impressive from the outside. I needed it to feel honest from the inside. That shift changed everything. If my sister had never called me crying that night, if I had never written those checks, if my husband had never crossed that line, I might still be living a life that looked stable but required me to shrink. The cost of that stability would have been my voice, my intuition, my sense of self. I didn't lose those things forever. I just had to fight to get them back. And now, standing firmly in who I am, I know this. Love that asks you to disappear is not love. Family that feeds on your sacrifice without regard for your well-being is not safe. And loyalty that flows in only one direction is not loyalty at all. I learned those lessons the hard way, but I learned them fully. By the time autumn returned, I realized I had stopped measuring my life in losses. I no longer counted what I'd lost with Daniel or what fractured with Alana. Instead, I noticed what had quietly entered my life in their absence. Space, time, choice. These weren't dramatic additions. They didn't announce themselves. They simply existed, waiting for me to notice. Thomas and I had settled into something steady, not intense, not performative, just real. He didn't try to be the center of my world, and I didn't need him to be. That balance felt new, healthy. When disagreements came up, we talked through them without raised voices or emotional manipulation. I paid attention to how my body responded in those moments. No knots in my stomach, no rehearsing conversations in my head, just presence. I told myself not to romanticize peace, but to respect it. One evening, we talked about finances. It might seem like an odd thing to mention, but it mattered to me deeply. After what I'd been through, money no longer felt neutral. It represented power, autonomy, safety. I explained to him that I had learned the hard way how easily financial generosity could be weaponized against you. He listened without defensiveness. He shared his own boundaries. We agreed early on that neither of us would rescue the other. Support, yes. Dependency, no. That conversation alone felt like rewriting a pattern I had lived in for decades. At work, I continued stepping into leadership. With authority came visibility, and with visibility came opinions, not all of them kind. I noticed how easily people questioned women who stopped over-explaining, who stopped apologizing for taking up space. I didn't engage with that noise. I had learned that confidence doesn't require permission. Around that time, my mother invited me to lunch, just the two of us. Over soup and bread, she admitted something she had never said before. She told me she had relied on me too much when we were younger, that she had leaned on my sense of responsibility when things felt unstable. She apologized for normalizing my role as the one who always gave. Her honesty caught me off guard. It softened something old between us. It reminded me that patterns don't come from nowhere. They're inherited, learned, and sometimes unconsciously reinforced. Naming them is the first step toward ending them. As winter approached, the anniversary of everything drew closer. 1 year since the night I stood in my living room and watched my life split in two. I wondered how I would feel when the date arrived, whether grief would resurface, whether anger would knock unexpectedly. When the day came, I took it off work. I didn't mark it with sadness, I marked it with intention. I went for a long walk, I cooked myself a good meal, I wrote a letter to the woman I had been a year earlier. In that letter, I told her she wasn't foolish, she was loving. I told her she deserved honesty from the people closest to her. I told her she would survive what she couldn't yet imagine. And when I finished writing, I felt a sense of completion settle over me, the kind that doesn't erase the past, but integrates it. Alana crossed my mind that day, not with bitterness, with a quiet sadness. I wondered if she was learning to live with the consequences of her choices, if she understood, finally, that being saved by someone does not give you ownership over their life. I hoped she was growing, but hope no longer required proximity. Later that evening, Thomas asked if I wanted company or solitude. I appreciated the question more than he knew. I chose company. We sat together, talking about nothing and everything. He didn't ask me to relive the day. He let me lead. That respect mattered. As the year closed, I found myself being asked for advice more often. Friends, coworkers, women from the group. They wanted to know how I rebuilt, how I trusted again, how I set boundaries without guilt. I never gave formulas. I shared truths. That healing doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. That boundaries are not punishments, they're instructions for how to treat you. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it's that self-respect is quiet but powerful. It doesn't argue, it doesn't chase, it simply stands firm and lets the rest reveal itself. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always resist them. That resistance is information. Pay attention to it. I don't know what my life will look like 5 years from now. I don't need to. I know how it feels now. Grounded, honest, intentionally lived. I know that I will never again confuse sacrifice with love or silence with strength. I know that my generosity will always come with discernment and my compassion with limits. Paying my sister's divorce did not make me responsible for her choices. Loving my husband did not oblige me to accept betrayal. And losing both of them did not mean losing myself. In fact, it meant finding myself more clearly than ever before. This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about reclamation, about waking up to your own worth after years of giving it away, and about choosing every single day to live a life that doesn't require you to disappear. By the time the second spring after everything arrived, I realized something profound had changed in me. I no longer introduced myself internally through pain. The story of what my sister and husband did had stopped being the first chapter of who I was. It was still part of my history, but it no longer narrated my present. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, the way real transformation usually does. Thomas and I had settled into a rhythm that felt earned, not perfect, but honest. We talked about the future without clinging to it, about shared values instead of shared fantasies. I told him early on that I would never again merge my life with someone who saw my resources, emotional, financial, or otherwise, as something they were entitled to. He didn't take that personally. He respected it. That respect deepened my trust more than grand gestures ever could. One afternoon, we visited a small art exhibit downtown. As I stood looking at a piece about rupture and repair, something unexpected happened. I felt gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the clarity it forced into my life. Before, I had been generous without discernment, loyal without reciprocity, patient without limits. I had mistaken endurance for love. That realization didn't shame me, it educated me. Later that week, a woman from the support group asked if I would consider speaking at a local community event. She said my story resonated because it wasn't dramatic revenge, it was quiet strength. I hesitated at first. Putting your pain into words for others requires revisiting places you've learned to walk past without flinching, but I said yes. When I stood at the podium, looking out at unfamiliar faces, I didn't recount every detail. I talked about what betrayal teaches you if you're willing to listen, that love without boundaries is not noble, that financial help should never come with the erasure of your safety, that being the strong one often means you're the most vulnerable to exploitation. I watched heads nod, eyes soften. I knew I was speaking truths many women had lived but never named. Afterward, a woman from the support group approached me, tears in her eyes. She said, "I always thought if I stopped helping, I'd be a bad person." I told her gently, "You're not bad for wanting to survive." That moment reminded me why telling the story mattered. Pain shared with purpose becomes something else entirely. It becomes guidance. My relationship with Alana remained distant but civil through occasional family updates. I didn't ask about her life, and she didn't push for closeness. That mutual restraint felt respectful. I no longer needed her remorse to validate my healing. I had already done the work she couldn't do for me. There was one final interaction with Daniel that closed a door for good. He emailed to let me know he was moving out of state. He wished me well. He said he hoped I was happy. I read the message once, then deleted it. Not out of anger, out of completion. He no longer needed space in my emotional world. I wished him growth, but from afar. What surprised me most was how my sense of self-trust had strengthened. I no longer questioned my instincts when something felt off. I no longer negotiated with red flags. That didn't make me cynical, it made me clear. I learned the difference between walls and boundaries. Walls shut everyone out. Boundaries let the right people in. As time went on, I became more intentional with my generosity. I helped when asked, but I asked questions first. I gave when it aligned with my values, not my guilt. I stopped funding chaos disguised as crisis. That change alone transformed my relationships. The people who stayed were the ones who respected me. The ones who disappeared told me everything I needed to know. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I thought back to the woman who wrote that first check for her sister's divorce, the woman who believed love could fix anything if she just gave enough. I felt tenderness toward her. She did the best she could with what she knew then, but I also felt proud of the woman I had become, the one who learned that love must include self-respect to survive. If there is a legacy I hope to leave through this story, it's this. You don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share blood or history. Support does not mean self-destruction, and betrayal, no matter how close it comes from, does not get to define the rest of your days. I didn't lose my husband and sister and end up alone. I lost illusions and gained myself. And that trade, painful as it was, gave me a life rooted in truth instead of obligation. Some people will never understand why you stopped giving. Let them misunderstand. The people who benefit from your exhaustion will always resent your rest. Choose yourself anyway. Because the moment you do, everything begins to change. As another year unfolded, my life no longer felt like a recovery project. It felt like a life. Full, intentional, earned. I stopped framing my days around what I had survived and started focusing on what I was building. That distinction mattered more than I ever expected. Survival teaches you resilience. Building teaches you joy. Thomas and I had grown closer, not through intensity, but through consistency. He showed up when he said he would. He listened without defensiveness. When disagreements surfaced, he didn't disappear or deflect, he stayed present. That steadiness rewired something in me that had once believed love had to be proven through sacrifice. With him, love felt mutual, not transactional. And because of that, I stayed aware. Gratitude without dependency, affection without self-abandonment. One afternoon, while we were cooking together, he asked if I ever thought about remarrying. The question didn't scare me. It didn't thrill me either. I told him the truth. I said I no longer measured commitment by legal titles or shared accounts. I measured it by daily choices, by respect, by how safe I felt being fully myself. He nodded and said he felt the same. That alignment mattered more than a ring ever could. At work, I had settled into my leadership role with confidence. I mentored younger women not by telling them what to do, but by modeling what it looked like to set boundaries without apology. I encouraged them to negotiate salaries, to say no without guilt, to trust their instincts even when others questioned them. Watching them grow reminded me of how far I had come. The support group invited me back to speak again, this time specifically about family betrayal. I hesitated, knowing how personal that subject still was for many. But when I spoke, I didn't focus on my sister or my ex-husband. I focused on the pattern. How often the most generous person in the family becomes the dumping ground for everyone else's chaos. How love gets confused with obligation. How silence becomes survival. I watched recognition ripple across the room. I knew I was speaking to wounds that had been hidden for years. After the talk, someone asked me if I had ever truly loved my sister. The question lingered with me long after the room emptied. The answer surprised me. Love doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it changes form. Sometimes it becomes distance. Sometimes it becomes a silent wish for someone's growth that no longer includes you. Loving her no longer meant access. It meant acceptance of reality. My mother's health declined briefly that year, and for a moment, old patterns threatened to resurface. The urge to step in, to take over, to manage everything alone. I caught myself. I asked for help. I delegated. I rested, and nothing fell apart. That experience reinforced a lesson I had learned the hard way. You don't have to carry everything to be worthy of love. Alana reached out once more, this time to tell me she was moving out of state for a new job. She said she wanted me to hear it from her. I thanked her for telling me and wished her well. There was no drama in the exchange, no reopening of wounds, just two adults acknowledging a shared past and separate futures. That neutrality felt like peace. As I stood in my kitchen that evening, sunlight spilling across the floor, I realized something quietly extraordinary. I was no longer afraid of being alone. That fear had once kept me over-giving, over-functioning, overstaying. Now, solitude felt like a choice, not a threat. And that freedom changed everything. If you're listening to this and you're struggling with guilt for stepping back from people who hurt you, I want you to hear this clearly. Distance is not cruelty. It is often the only way healing can breathe. You are not responsible for repairing what you did not break. Paying for my sister's divorce didn't ruin my life. It revealed the truth about the people in it and the patterns I needed to release. Losing my husband didn't mean I failed at love. It meant I refused to accept a version of love that required betrayal to survive. The woman I am now knows how to give without losing herself. She knows how to love without disappearing. She knows that peace is not something you stumble into. It's something you choose again and again, even when it costs you people you never thought you'd lose. And if this story has taught me anything, it's this. Sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away with your dignity intact. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop paying the price for other people's choices. I didn't get revenge. I got my life back. By the time I understood that my story no longer needed an ending shaped by pain, I also understood something else. Healing isn't about forgetting who hurt you. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to shrink. That realization came to me quietly, on an ordinary morning, while I was making coffee and watching the light move across my kitchen floor. Nothing dramatic happened, no revelation, just a calm certainty that I was finally living from the inside out. My life had settled into something honest, not curated, not explained, just lived. I no longer felt the urge to justify my choices to anyone who hadn't lived my story. I trusted myself now, and that trust was the most valuable thing I had gained from everything I'd lost. Thomas and I continued forward with intention. We didn't rush milestones or perform commitment for anyone else's comfort. We built something rooted in communication and mutual respect. There was no competition for sacrifice, no silent scorekeeping. If something felt off, we talked about it. If something needed space, we gave it. Love no longer felt like labor. It felt like collaboration. One evening, as we sat together in comfortable silence, he told me something that stayed with me. He said, "You don't give yourself away anymore. You share yourself." I hadn't realized how visible that change had become, but he was right. I was no longer emptying myself to prove my worth. I was choosing where and how to give, and that choice made all the difference. At work, I watched younger women step into their voices, and I recognized parts of my younger self in them. I made a point to tell them what I had once needed to hear, that being dependable doesn't mean being disposable, that love and loyalty should be mutual, not assumed, that boundaries don't make you difficult, they make you safe. I stopped being the family emergency fund, the emotional dumping ground, the silent fixer. And yes, some relationships changed because of that. Some people drifted away, others adjusted. I let both happen without chasing explanations. The people who truly valued me learned how to meet me where I stood instead of where I used to bend. There were still moments of reflection. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about Alana, about the little girl who once followed me everywhere, about how pain can twist people into versions of themselves they don't recognize until it's too late. I didn't excuse her choices, but I no longer carried them like a burden. Forgiveness, for me, had become acceptance without access. Daniel became a distant memory, no longer charged with emotion, just a chapter that ended because it had to. I didn't need him to understand the damage he caused for my healing to be complete. Accountability is important, but it isn't always granted. Closure, I learned, is something you can give yourself. If there's one truth I want to leave you with, it's this. Being kind does not mean being available for harm. Being generous does not mean being exploitable. And loving someone does not mean betraying yourself to keep them comfortable. I paid for my sister's divorce because I believed love meant showing up no matter the cost. What I learned is that love without boundaries can become a doorway for betrayal. The lesson was brutal, yes, but it was also transformative. It taught me how to protect my heart without hardening it, how to give without disappearing, how to walk away without losing my dignity. Today, my life is quieter, stronger, more honest. I don't rescue anymore. I support when it's healthy. I don't chase closeness. I allow it to grow where it's earned. I don't fear being alone. I value being at peace. If you are listening to this and you are standing at the edge of a betrayal that feels impossible to survive, hear me clearly. You will survive it. And not just survive, you will emerge with a clarity you didn't know you needed. You will learn that your worth was never tied to how much you gave, how much you endured, or how much you forgave. Sometimes the people you save end up being the ones who try to destroy you. And sometimes losing them is the very thing that saves you. This is not a story about what was taken from me. It's a story about what I finally stopped giving away.